Retired teacher Mrs. Laura was used to the quiet of the nights in her secluded neighborhood. Her routine was her refuge, and the solitude of the darkened streets felt like a comfortable blanket. But then something strange began to happen. Every night, right at midnight, she'd hear the sound of tires rolling slowly down the empty street. The first time, she chalked it up to coincidence, but soon the unsettling sensation grew. A black car, always the same, would pass by her house, its silhouette looming under the dim streetlights. It was like a shadow gliding through the night, moving with unnerving slowness as though it were waiting for something, or perhaps someone. At first, Mrs. Laura tried to ignore it. After all, she had lived alone for years, and the silence had become a comforting part of her routine. But the car's behavior or presence felt more invasive with each passing night. There was never a sound of the engine shutting off, no doors slamming. And no matter how closely she peered through the curtains, she could never make out the driver's face. It wasn't just a car, it was a dark presence, something that seemed to hover on the edges of her existence, drawing closer with every passing hour. The sensation of being watched, of something unseen observing her, began to gnaw at her. Her curiosity began to shift into something darker. Mrs. Laura had lived alone for so long she was used to the stillness, but now that stillness felt heavy, suffocating. She tried to rationalize her growing unease. Perhaps it was just a strange coincidence, a regular passing vehicle. But the sensation of being watched lingered. Night after night, she found herself awake, waiting for the car to arrive. It became a ritual. And soon it became more than a ritual. It became an obsession. One night, when the car once again stopped in front of her house, everything felt different. The headlights illuminated her bedroom window with an eerie intensity, casting elongated shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. Time itself seemed to freeze. Mrs. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. Her windows were shut, her curtains drawn tight, but she could still feel the car's gaze seeping into the room. It was no longer just a strange vehicle, it was something other. There was an unmistakable malice behind it now, something malevolent, lurking just out of sight. Her terror, at first subtle, now consumed her. She had lived alone for years, comfortable in the quiet of her solitude, but this wasn't just a passing disturbance. This was something else. Something worse. Something beyond explanation. Mrs. Laura knew she couldn't continue living under the shadow of uncertainty. Every night, she could feel the weight of it, the dread of the unknown pressing down on her. She couldn't pretend it was a coincidence anymore. The car wasn't just passing by. It was stalking her, watching her, waiting for something, or someone. Her curiosity had reached its breaking point. No longer could she be a passive observer, waiting for the car to pass like a normal part of her routine. The fear had eaten away at her sanity long enough. She had to know. She had to confront whatever was behind the car, whatever was behind the eyes that felt like they were constantly watching her. The terror and the unknown were slowly but surely pushing her to the edge of reason. If you don't take risks, you'll never know, she thought, her body trembling with anticipation. The adrenaline surged as she made the decision. She would follow the car. The truth had become more important than the fear. She couldn't live in the dark anymore. The mystery had to be solved. The night would reveal everything. The following night, she prepared herself carefully. Lights off. Quiet footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat as she checked the time, her watch ticking toward midnight. It was as though the car, like clockwork, would appear at the same moment, like it knew she was waiting for it. And then there it was, creeping down the street once more, moving slowly, deliberately. She waited for the exact moment it passed her window, then silently slipped from her house, heart racing. She followed it at a distance, careful not to make a sound. The cold night air seemed to press in on her as she walked. Every step felt heavier than the last, each breath more labored. She kept her pace, but the eerie sound of the engine breaking the silence filled her ears. With every turn the car made, it seemed to fade further into the darkness, vanishing just when she thought she had it in her sights. It was as though the car was toying with her, challenging her perception of reality. She wasn't sure whether she was still in control of her actions or if, by now, the car's presence had seeped into her mind. The further she walked, the stronger the feeling became that she wasn't simply following the car. She was being led somewhere. Somewhere dark. Somewhere she wasn't supposed to go. When the chase led her down an even more isolated road, her instincts screamed at her to stop, but her feet wouldn't obey. The car was moving ahead with unnerving calmness, as if it were aware of her every step, as if it wanted her to keep following. Every instinct told her to turn back, but the pull was irresistible. She was no longer just a witness to the mystery, she was a part of it. The road grew more desolate, the air growing thicker with every step. And then, at the end of the road, an old warehouse came into view. Its looming presence seemed unnatural against the empty horizon. Mrs. Laura froze. The building was out of place, like it didn't belong in her world. It felt like it had always been there, hidden from sight, waiting for her. The car stopped in front of it, its headlights casting long, haunting shadows across the warehouse. The silence was absolute. Every nerve in Mrs. Laura's body screamed at her to run, to turn around and never look back, but the pull of curiosity was stronger. She moved forward, drawn to the warehouse like a moth to a flame, her heart pounding in her chest. The closer she got, the more her surroundings seemed to shift, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. She was being swallowed by the night. When she reached the warehouse, she realized the door was slightly ajar. Cold, unnatural light poured from the gap, not like any light she had ever seen. Too harsh, too old, like it came from a time that shouldn't exist. Her breath caught in her throat as she peered inside. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. There, standing motionless, was a hooded figure. But it wasn't just the figure that made her blood run cold, it was the way it moved. It wasn't human. The figure jerked in movements that felt wrong, mechanical, like something out of a nightmare. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then it hit her, the figure saw her. Saw her in a way that shouldn't have been possible. She was no longer an observer, she was a part of whatever terrible thing was unfolding in front of her. Panic seized her chest, her limbs trembling. The urge to run flooded her mind, and she bolted away from the window, her heart hammering. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Every step was a frantic sprint as she raced back to her house, the feeling of being chased never leaving her. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with each breath. She reached her car, leaped inside, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life as she sped away, but the sense of something watching her didn't fade. Would never fade. The next morning, Mrs. Laura was still shaking. The images of the warehouse, the hooded figure, burned into her memory. What had she seen? What was happening? The fear gnawed at her, but there was something else. A desperate need to understand, to find the answers that the night had stolen from her. And then, that cold, unsettling morning, the sirens broke through her thoughts. A police car pulled up to her street, officers dragging a man from a neighbor's house. The fear that had settled in her chest took on a new shape, sharper, more real. The man who had lived so quietly just a few houses down, he wasn't just an ordinary neighbor. He was part of something. Something sinister. Mrs. Laura followed the officers, her mind racing. The neighbor's wife answered the door, shaking, her face pale. He wasn't what he seemed, she murmured, eyes wide with terror. That warehouse, the things he did there. The woman began crying, and Mrs. Laura's world tilted. The neighbor, he wasn't just a neighbor. He was part of a dark cult. And the warehouse, it was where twisted rituals had been performed. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Everything, the black car, the feeling of being watched, the strange, suffocating presence, was part of something much darker than she could have imagined. She hadn't been an observer. She had been drawn in. A pawn in a game she didn't understand. And now Mrs. Laura knew the truth. But the truth was even more terrifying than the fear she had lived with. The question now was, could she escape the shadows? Or was she already too deep?